Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool with NathanCoolPhoto.com, and in this video I want to give a full review of the new Godox AD200 Pro. Now if you might recall from my last video, I did some comparisons between the Evolve 200 or the AD200 and how that compared to the bigger Explorer 600, how it compared to speedlights, and what the power difference was between that. Since then I've gotten a lot of requests to do a full shoot using one of the AD200s because, as you know, I use the Explorer quite a bit. And so I took this out, did some field testing. I was able to get my hands on the new AD200 Pro, so I wanted to compare that against the older model, the AD200, see what the differences were. And instead of, as you know, when I do reviews, I don't like to just take it out of the box. I like to put it in the field, put it through its paces. So I did a bunch of testing, I have a bunch of results here, and I want to share that with you. So first off, though, let's take a look at just some of the examples of some of what I shot using the new AD200 Pro. So this was a typical smaller type of home. It was empty, and you can see through the kitchen here. This was shot with the AD200, and I did also some flash pops on the other end of the kitchen a little bit with a speed light, and had another speed light in the far room in the dining room. Here's a larger area, it's all empty. I'm in the corner of the dining room. I have the AD200 high up on a stand around the corner that's in that far room, bouncing off the ceiling, small speed light in the kitchen, speed light then near the camera. So as you can see, it did a fairly good job on this, and once again the power levels came in the same, but with a little bit of a surprise once we started doing some of the testing. There were also some color cast issues that I ran into. Some of it is usage, some of it is inherent with some of these lights, and I want to be able to go through all that with you, and I'll be getting to that last. What I want to first do is start with some of the more important features and then end with some of the least important features. So that actually was kind of least important because there are some workarounds and some of it is a usage thing, and I'll cover that then later on in the video. So first thing though, on our test results here, let's take a look at how well it did on power. So similar to the last test results when I explained in the last video, I did this at about 10 feet away, and this was using the Evolve 200 and then the Godox AD200 Pro and a speed light, and then comparing those. So when we take a look at those flash results, as I bring those up here, it was a little bit better on the 200 Pro. Now I did this a number of times and got fairly consistent results. So at about a quarter power doing a ceiling bounce, the 200 measured f4 on a light meter, and the 200 Pro was a little bit higher, that almost a half stop brighter actually. When we got up though a little bit higher into about the half power and then the full power, we can see that there's still a little bit more power coming out of the 200 Pro. Not a whole lot more, but still seem to be a little bit more. And of course this could be a small difference between the two flash units just in manufacturing from unit to unit, not necessarily this model, but it didn't perform any worse. And the one thing once again also to note is that it does measure at about 2 speed lights as the equivalent. So when we take a look at even full power, the speed lights measuring f5.6, and then the 200s, they tend to measure at around f8, although a little bit higher and just a tad higher on the 200 Pro. So that was good news, in that we got a little bit more power out of the 200 Pro, but once again, it could just be unit to unit during the manufacturing, unit to unit here, not necessarily the model going from the 200 to the 200 Pro. But that is nice to have a little bit more power. The next thing that I found most beneficial with the 200 Pro over the 200 is the display. It's not brighter, but it's recessed, and let's take a closer look at that. One of the advantages with the AD200 Pro compared to the 200 is that the 200 Pro over here on the left has a recessed display compared to the 200, the older model, didn't. So this was always, in the older model, susceptible to cracking because that display was just flush, and then the controls stuck out a little bit. You really couldn't set that face down to have it shooting straight up like you would a speed light sitting on a little stand foot. So that made it a little annoying, and of course just susceptible to breakage. Here it's more protected. It's recessed maybe about a millimeter or so. It's recessed enough where you can lay this flat and barely the controls don't get touched. But it would have been nice to see this recessed even a little bit more just by extending the body maybe just 1 more millimeter out of that plastic. But I'll tell you, it's better than what it was, so definitely not as susceptible to cracking. One of the issues though you'll still have is that the brightness of the displays are still kind of on the weak side. So this is about as bright as you can get them now. It's not that bad if you're working with real estate photography, because most of the time we have these facing up doing ceiling bounces. So that's not too much of an issue. But there is another difference when it comes to the display, and of course it doesn't matter which model that you look at, and that's that since we do face them up, we don't see the display. Now, one of the things that's different, they come with a light stand mount. The 200 has its own, the 200 Pro has one. If you use the 200, it's got one of those clicky ones. That's all right, it's not that bad, but there's a more fluid one that comes with the 200 Pro, so you loosen that up, and this guy can move then back and forth, and there's really no issue with the clicking. So I found that to be just smoother, less annoying. I've never really had a problem too much with the clicky type of any of those light stand mounts. They usually last quite a bit, but they do get wear and tear, and they're just plastic pieces. Having more of a clutch type mechanism, which is on this particular, the AD200 Pro, having that clutch mechanism makes it a little bit easier then to move it around, and you're not forcing it to try to do different positions with it. If you do want to do a bounce, for instance, you just have to, off of like a white reflector, you just have to move it to that position and you're fine. The other thing too that I found, it had a bit of a nicer stand mount overall. Now it is ergonomic enough to where if I take this off, I can use this and it can double as a handle. The other one can too, but this just seemed to have a little bit more ergonomic grip to it because it has the knobs placed differently on either side compared to the 200 mount, which has 3 knobs and they're kind of all over the place. The other thing too that makes this nice for the 200 Pro, let me put this just back on the stand, is that they have a nice little thumb wheel here for this light stand mount. So you can just screw that light stand mount and then the light comes off of it. So that makes it a lot more portable to work with. So you just unscrew that and that's fine. So you don't have to turn this whole head. So that makes it a little bit easier when you're putting it on light stands or just moving it around to other type of connectors that you may have. You just spin that in there. Now it is, a thumb wheel, so it takes a little bit longer, but I found that to be extremely useful compared to the Evolve 200. So taking a look at the older 200 series, to do something like that, it's just a little bit more cumbersome. And if you have one of these, you've already seen this already. One of the things that I didn't like with this older light stand mount is that it has a component, another third link to the chain here, so to speak, where this comes out. So you have to make sure that this little nub that's normally in your light stand, that goes into here very well, and then you have to have that tightened. So that actually makes then a third little control on that little light stand mount, making sure now that you have to have 1, 2, and then 3 of these things tight to make sure that it doesn't fall off of a light stand. Compared to the 200 Pro, that's really not much of an issue. You just got that one there. You've got the one that turns it to this side here, up and down, that real nice fluid motion, and then that's all that you have to worry about mounting that onto a stand. You can move it back and forth to any position that you want. The next thing I'd like to talk about is my feelings about the battery. Now, I use this. This is the 200 Pro, and I used this on that one shoot. It was an average size house, and I ended up using 50% of the battery power on just that one shoot. Now, that was a little bit disappointing. I'm used to using the Explorer 600, which I can probably on an average shoot like that not even use 1/4 of the power of it, and it's not so much because of flash power, but also because of the battery size that's in there. So that's a little disappointing. It's just basically has, for me, about the same amount of power that I'd get out, the battery life that I'd get out of a shoot compared to just using a speed light or two. So didn't find the battery to be all that more beneficial, but that's also some of the same problem with the AD200. Depends, of course, on how much flash power you're using. That could vary somewhat, but on what I typically do for my exposures and using this as an equivalent, as I show in the last video for flash power, I ended up using 50%. Now the other thing though with that, and that bothers me a little bit, and both of these units have this, is that the battery itself is in this plastic compartment that doesn't really have any metal connections like the Explorer 600 does, and I didn't find it really to be as well built as some of the speed lights. It doesn't matter if it's a 200 Pro or 200, they basically have the same thing. There's a release mechanism here, and you pull on it, and it then unloads a spring mechanism that's inside. There's springs that are inside there, and then this is the battery itself. So it's about a decent sized battery, about the size of 4 AA's. I would expect though to get probably about the same life out of that I would out of a speed light, since it's not that big of a lithium ion battery. So the one thing though with that is that the mechanisms for it all are plastic, and so you've got a little latch here and there's a little latch in here that I'm pushing on it. Of course that's moving then the release lever there. So putting it in there, sometimes I found that stuck. There is a nice groove that's in the battery so that it goes in only one direction. So that's fine, but it was a little bit cumbersome. So I found just pulling that off was a little bit safer, and then letting that rest in there. So a little tip I found I think would probably extend the life of this battery, pushing it in and out, and be less susceptible to breaking that lever. If I just pushed it in, I would find though a lot of times it would just pop right back out and it wouldn't latch very well. And that's because the spring load on this particular model anyways, probably is a little bit off. Now I could probably send this back and get another one sent to me, but I found just a quick thing to do is just pull the lever to the side as though I were releasing it, put the battery all the way in, and then push it in and lock it in place. And that's all there was to it. So basically manually doing everything by removing it that way, moving it to the side, putting it all the way in, and then putting the lever in, and that seemed to be fine. I think that would also give it a little bit more life instead of having all that friction placed against this lower end plastic mechanism. Now, will that last a long time? It might, but if I have to change this battery once, maybe twice throughout the day for all the shoots that I'd be doing, and then if I have to do that every day and throughout the year, I'm taking a look at hundreds of battery changes just in 1 year off this light, and I just couldn't imagine this lasting for more than a couple years. So it's something to consider when it comes to some of the long life lasting features of this compared to say the Explorer 600. The Explorer 600 is a beast when it comes to the battery. It's got metal connectors that hold it in place, and I found even some of the speed light doors are better well built than what this mechanism is on either, once again, the AD200 or the AD200 Pro. Taking a closer look at the display too, wanted to point out something that I found just a little annoyingly different with the AD200 Pro compared to the AD200. Now I'm sure that Godox probably figures this as a feature. I find it more of not necessarily a bug, but a high annoyance, is that the display, I'll just turn that on so it's a little bit brighter and you can see, is that most lights use their thumb wheels for manual adjustments in third stop increments. So in other words, you would be at like half power, then half power plus 3, half power plus 7 until you get to 1. Instead, what they do is every thumb wheel click is 1/10 of a stop. Now, you might find that to be quite useful. You might think that, oh, that would be very great. I can make small little adjustments to my light. I think that's actually, though, quite academic. I've never found, even on the bigger lights, any need to go in those type of increments of power. So, and now when I'm working with some of my Einsteins on products, and that's been one thing where I've got, a little bit more fine control, but using these as one little stop, it doesn't do much on the manual control. Plus, if you're using the trigger mostly on this, the R2 Pro trigger doesn't work in 1/10 increments. It works in those 1/3 stops. So if you've got a collection of lights that you're using and you're used to using 1/3 stops, and you go over here quickly and you go 1, 2, 3 to increase the power, you only increased it by 1/3 stop. I'm used to going 1, 2, 3 and I'm up 1 full stop. Here though, I've got to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 clicks. Now, of course, that puts a little bit more wear and tear on the thumb wheel. Not that big of a deal. It might have a very long life, but it is just one of those small annoyances where it is different than from the AD200 and the Explorer 600s, most speed lights, most mono lights, most lights in general. Something else too to be aware of, and this is something that I noticed when I was on site when I started getting some color cast issues, the most A common head to use for real estate photography, for my recommendation, would be the Fresnel head that comes with it. That's this guy here. The head can be easily changed back and forth, and it does come with a bare bulb, but of course the bare bulb has to be protected somehow if you're moving around a site and you're hand holding this and quickly moving through a property. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. We're not using umbrellas in real estate photography very often, so the Fresnel head wins the day for something to protect the light as you're moving around. But unlike a speed light or other lights that have Fresnels, is that the AD200 and AD200 Pro have a big gap that runs along either side. And in that gap also there's a cutout that goes the length of that. So what happens is that you do get good Fresnel diffusion coming out of the Fresnel lens that's put over top of the light, but you get a lot of light leakage, that comes out of this. So you might think, well, that's probably not bad, that's quite a bit, but let's take a look here at some bloom. So this is a bloom test that I ran to see how well this would shed light up against a wall. Now we can see that in this case, where I have the speed light, the AD200 Pro about a foot away from the wall, we can see two bars that are being shed very harshly up onto the ceiling. And those bars are from those gaps that are on either side of that Fresnel head. Taking a look at this image, when we turn the head around, we get a little bit closer, about 6 inches from the wall. We see that one of the bars is now hitting the joint, and it's hitting it so hard that I'm casting a lot of color back into the room. So to avoid that then, if you're using the Fresnel head, you have to make sure that it's far enough away from any of these colored walls. Now, one of the things you might think of is like, well, I could maybe use a flash bender on this or something else, but that also can cause problems, and I'll get to that next. So one possible solution to that problem of light leakage through that Fresnel head opening is that you might think, well, I could put this, it's probably less than $10 piece of gear, which is one of these little bounce reflectors, or bounce, they call them reflector diffusers sometimes. It's a small little thing where on the back, it's more than just a diffuser material on the back. It's got gobo, and then on the inside, on that other side of the gobo, it's a silver reflector. And that way, any light that is bouncing around gets reflected back out. So it's similar to using then a flash bender, and you might have seen these before, where a flash bender then has something that wraps around, usually with Velcro and some snaps, around a flash head, and then you could direct it. And of course the flash bender directs more light all kinds of different ways. But that doesn't really work as well for real estate photography because we've got something too close to the light. We want good fall off and diffusion, so we want that to be farther away. Having it right up against the light isn't helpful. Let me show you an example testing this. So this right here is a shot using the AD200 Pro, and this is just of my living room here just to do some tests. Now this next shot is where I attach then that diffuser reflector. You can see that I've got more light shedding into the room, but it's doing what we don't want to happen, and that's it's casting a harsh shadow across that ceiling fan. It's as though I'm pointing the flash directly into the room, which is of course the case what happens when you're using one of these domed or type of flash benders, diffuser reflectors. What's happening once again, just why that is occurring, is because the light is going back off of that reflector. It's going into the room. We might as well just be pointing the flash into the room at that point because it's giving us that same type of bad fall off and not nearly as much diffusion because of that. So anyways, the Fresnel head leakage was a bit of a problem in that without using this, which really isn't going to be useful for doing real estate photography, maybe in some cases where you don't have ceiling elements to worry about, casting shadows, it might work, but for most of the time, I mean, to keep that on and off, I don't think would be realistic. So by keeping this though a little farther away from the wall, you can then avoid those nasty light leaks from those two bars coming across the Fresnel head and still get pretty good light distribution. So one of the last things, and it was really one of the least important of the issues, is something that you might read a lot about the white balance problems of the AD200 and the AD200 Pro. Now, I did find quite a variance in white balance, but in all honesty, it's kind of just academic, really. The white balance I did find varied throughout different shots, different flash power, to be within their range of plus or minus 200 Kelvin. I was measuring closer to about 250 350 Kelvin on some of the extreme cases. One thing I did notice is that it did tend to shoot just a little bit warmer. Now, some of that could be because of the Fresnel head compared to possibly the diffuser on the Explorer 600. I found it though to vary just about as much as you would kind of one of the lower end speed lights. So a lot of speed lights will vary by that much. Now, when you're talking about the cost savings compared to like a Pro Photo B1, which has a plus or minus 100 Kelvin throughout the entire power range, that's really great. So you can save yourself a lot of money because a Pro Photo is going to cost you a couple grand at least for depending on the model, compared to just spending $350 for the AD200 Pro and about $300 for the older model for the AD200. The one thing though that the AD200 Pro has come out with that the AD200 didn't have is it has a color mode. So you can adjust it so that throughout the color range it only varies by plus or minus 100 Kelvin. Now, I didn't do a lot of testing with that because I found another bug. So one of the problems is that if you use color mode and you use the triggering system, that the first time you fire the triggering system, everything's okay. If you change the color mode, go back and forth with that, and you try to do any manual adjustments, then it's going to try to still use that last power off the trigger, not what you're now setting manually. So it's kind of a little bit of confusing between, okay, well, is the trigger now set and am I manually adjusting it? That though is really not that far different from just using these type of lights with those triggers, the commanders as well. So take for instance the R2 Pro. That type of a trigger, and I have a video by the way on that and how to use that in manual mode and in this also, and there's a link up here you can see to go find that. So with that though, is if you're used to going around, I'm just going to change some of that manually, not using the triggers, it just starts confusing things all the more. So to keep things simple and not really confuse things anymore, finding that bug with the color mode, I just skipped it all entirely. But it does exist. It's something that Godox has tested. I haven't bothered messing with it. I didn't find it once again to be that much of a difference. Let's take this example for instance. So we can see here that if I shoot this at 1 white balance, it looks fairly good. If I increase the white balance and warm it up by 200 Kelvin, you can hardly see any difference on the other side here. So that really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Once again, it comes down to somewhat of an academic issue. One thing though is I found that from shot to shot, typically the white balance stayed the same. It was more from the variance in power where some of that was changing. So anyways, that's my review of it. Overall, if I were to go ahead and rank this, I'd say that if you were going to get the AD200, you should really opt for the AD200 Pro. These are just my opinions on it, of course. I do have a link to this out on Amazon where you've got a ton of other reviews. So you can see what other people are saying about it. One thing though, putting it through the field test is more than just opening up the box and saying, hey, look what it looks like as it comes out. I think this is great. I just took a picture with it. So putting it through its paces, I really have found this to be a more worthwhile flash unit than just the AD200. So with that said though, I still opt for the Explorer 600 for the type of work I do. I find that fits my niche a lot better, but the Explorer 600 is a 7-pound light and it is a lot to carry around. So if you're looking for something lightweight, then this is definitely an option for you. Once again though, as you've seen in my last video, it takes 2 of these to equal the power of one Explorer 600. So at $350 each, you're taking a look at $700, which if you were to get the TTL version of the Explorer 600, you might be in that range, but for real estate photography, opting for the non-TTL version, then the Explorer 600 comes down to only $550. Unfortunately, none of the AD200s, whether it's Pro or the older model, they have a non-TTL version. I would have liked to seen that because for us in real estate photography, it just doesn't matter. TTL works against us, not for us, as we need consistency across all those various flash frames that get composited and melded together. So that doesn't do us much good. So anyways, if they could do that and come down in price, I think that would be fantastic. I reached out to Godox too, asking them, I haven't heard anything back yet about the power switch. There have been complaints originally when the 200 came out that the power switch would tend to break and fail over time. I noticed they did have a different power switch on the AD200 Pro. I'm hoping that will last longer. I haven't had the problem or seen it, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion in any of the recent groups concerning the power switch switch that I've seen either, but that's something to be seen yet, and we'll see how this lasts over time. I'll still incorporate it on some other shoots. I still see this having some value, especially if I were doing apartments and I have to do multiple setups in a building, where I can just pop one of these or two of those in the same case that I've got my camera in, because it is a lot more portable, and then I don't have to worry about taking the Explorer 600s out. This would be the guy to do the job for that. So I see a lot of use for this in real estate photography, but once again, I'm still a big fan of the Explorer 600. Anyways, I hope this video is useful for you and that you can use some of this information in the photography that you do as well. If you did like this video, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.